Well, thank you for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with you all this morning, and I'd like to thank you all for letting me to trespass into your territory. Having spent my career, as you've heard, mostly as an archivist, dealing with paper and not material culture, it's with a little trepidation I step in from my two-dimensional world into your three-dimensional world. But since we share the same passions, the study of culture and the manifestations of it, and a fascination of human expression into tangible formats, I guess I can continue on without further apologies. But now asking for forgiveness for my trespasses, I have to render thanks and express my gratitude to those scholars who've gone before me, and specifically Daniel Kurt Ackerman and Jean Waddell for their work on the Synagogues of KKBE. And that's what you see on the screen if I push the button, I guess. Let's see. A little too fast on the draw. There we are. Okay. I hope to build on their work this morning, and with some of it, and if not new conclusions, then educated guesses at least. And to start off, I'll do the alpha and the omega thing. I'm going to give my end first. In 1841, when the Jews of Charleston were dedicating their new synagogue after the loss of their earlier to yet another fire, the Rabbi Gustavus Poznansky said the most amazing thing, defying thousands of years of tradition of diaspora wandering that tied Jewish destiny to a return to the Holy Land. He said instead that this building, he said of this building that was dedicated that day, quote, "This synagogue is our temple, this synagogue our Jerusalem, this happy land our Palestine." The story of how that came to pass can fill volumes, but today I'm going to pursue a much narrower focus, instead describing how the Jews of Charleston broke with millennia of Orthodox Jewish teaching to become the cradle of Reform Judaism in America. But of course, I'm just going to limit myself to its manifestations in the KKBE sanctuaries. But to do that, I still have to maybe go backwards a little to the context of these buildings rose in Charleston. Charleston, as you've heard, is called the Holy City. I do not agree with the fact that some people say that the nickname dates back to Carolina's founding, with the Lord's proprietor, Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, tasking his secretary, John Locke, with drafting a fundamental constitution. Though it was never technically adopted, it nevertheless provided a framework for governing. No atheists were allowed, so if y'all want to politely leave the room quietly, no atheists were allowed in Carolina, but Jews and other dissenters from the purity of Christian religion were allowed here. And so they came, and why not? Because Carolina was truly the most welcoming spot for Jews on the American continent, making Charleston by 1800 the true Jewish metropolis in the United States. And if there's anybody from New York, but excuse me, so in 1800, if New York had 600 Jews, Charleston had 800. So the first who came here were Sephardic, mostly descendant Jews from Spain and Portugal, expelled in 1492, but there were Eastern European Jews, Ashkenazic Jews here as well from the beginning. But the congregation, Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, Holy Congregation, House of God, was founded in 1749. It was set up to follow those Sephardic rituals. They worshipped in a variety of structures first, and actually they rented buildings not far from here, which are no longer standing. But it was not until 1794 that they finished this building and dedicated their first sanctuary. This is the earliest view we have of it, sketched by John Reuben Smith in 1812, the originals in the Library of Congress. The names that have come down to us as designers and builders are Steed and Horlbeck. The latter names are very documentable in Charleston. Our previous speaker talked about the Exchange Building. Peter and John Horlbeck built many of the great structures in the city of Charleston, and the Exchange Building, which anchors Broad Street, which you're not familiar with it, I'm sure you'll see it on your tour. And the great Charleston architect Robert Mills describes the Jews' synagogue as a remarkably neat building crowned with a cupola. The grounds around it are enclosed with iron railings and laid out with taste. Here's an 1838 view showing the iron railings, and they're built circa 1819, and they're still standing. You can see that the building runs parallel to the street, The entrance faced west. Inside, as you'll see in a bit, as you entered, you would see centered on the eastern wall the ark holding the Torah scrolls. In all synagogues built since the diaspora, this was the pattern. When congregations faced the ark, they would be facing Jerusalem. And of course, you see no graveyard. Corpses considered unclean by Jewish custom mandated burial far away. In cemeteries, a pattern held in Charleston too. This is about a mile away from the synagogue with KKBE's Cumming Street Cemetery, a brief view here, and gravestones dating back to 1762. And the funerary monument on your right is associated with David Lopez that I'll be talking about in a minute as well. So I thought we'd put the two views together. As we know, that the synagogue was built of brick. It was stucco and painted. It measured 70 feet long and 40 feet across. There's a belt course wrapping around the entire building and rusticated coins at the corners. Its west side door is embellished with an inset dedicatory plaque. Let's see if I can get, plaque right there. You can see all the compass-headed windows in the sanctuary and in the entrance chamber, which would have been the entrance chamber here. And we think probably that contained the staircases that would have led up to the balconies, and that would be women that would be sitting in the balconies there. You've probably already seen St. Michael's just down the street from your hotel. It was a magnificent building meant to be seen and not hidden away like some European synagogues were. It obviously was inspired by St. Michael's, and its spire is seen here. KKBE was certainly one of the first, if not the first synagogue in America to have a spire on it. Charleston architect Robert Mills called it a cupola, however, and not a steeple, and so maybe it did function as a cupola to admit light into the sanctuary below. But even if we can't be sure of its function, we can see what it was telegraphing to everyone who could see it. Out and proud Charleston Jews were declaring their equal rights to worship, their synagogue exterior reflecting their equality in total integration, but not assimilation into the culture of the city. St. Michael's octagonal spire sits on a square rusticated base with the first level of compass-headed windows. Ditto KKBE's. Both are capped with a weather vane. KKBE stood 75 feet tall, where St. Michael's still stands at 165 feet tall. But it must have been like getting the bends for some of the people. Outside the building is New World totally, but as soon as you stepped into it, you were whisked back in time and reminded of your Old World roots following the pattern of Spanish-Portuguese synagogues in Europe. We have two images, a painting by congregant Solomon Nunez Carvalho in 1838, and a lithograph based on that painting, and by that way, the earliest lithograph of the exterior was also by Solomon Nunez Carvalho as well. So if you see where we are, we've entered through the west doorway, and we're looking to the east at the ark, which was finished in 1799 out of mahogany. It's 3 bays wide, it's got fluted pilasters, and a curved inset or bonnet at the top, and their 10 commandments are etched out in marble. Along the side walls on the north and south and above our heads are the women's balconies, as I said, Orthodox, keeping the gender separate. Those balconies stand on simple columns with simple moldings, and there's a barrel vaulted ceiling. And to the left, you can see a canopied seat. Let's see if I can hit it. Yep, a canopied seat over here, and then over there in the painting. And that's where the elders of the congregation, the president, the Parnasim, would sit. And there are no ordained rabbis in America at this time. And in the center, not in the center exactly, and more about that later, is the reader's desk, or bema, raised by 4 steps and closed by a railing. When it was time to read the portion from the scriptures, the reader would open the doors of the ark. The congregation would stand, the Torah scrolls would be taken out, moved over to the reader's desk, and the men, only the men sitting downstairs, would often come up and approach the Holy Scriptures, and with their prayer shawls possibly try to kiss the Torah, and then the reader would bring it to the desk, and then they would read that week's portion of the Holy Scriptures. Scholars, specifically Daniel Ackerman, I understand no longer of Mesda, have suggested that in the placement of this bema, of this reading desk, it shows that KKBE has come to a compromise between Jewish geographies of the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic world. Sephardic ritual although Sephardic ritual is being followed in this congregation, the congregation would eventually become more Ashkenazic, more German-oriented. And there are differences, as you can see actually in these two pieces of silver, Rimonim, the silver scrolls, the silver finials that would be put on top of the Torah scrolls and removed before they were reading. There are two distinctive types of, even showing up in material culture, between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim. So you can see that there's the bulbous Ashkenazic form, and then there's the stacked gloam of the Sephardic. So the tug between these two between these two ways of religion did not show up just in silver, but actually also shows up in the creation of this building. Historically, as you can see in this diagram, German Jews usually had their reading desk right smack in the center of the building, but the Spanish Portuguese had it toward the back. But evidence in that Carvalho images suggests that the congregations from the two different traditions, they achieved a compromise and a delicate balance, following maybe the wisdom of Solomon, if not cutting it exactly in half. But they actually put the reader's desk not exactly on the western end and not exactly in the middle, but somewhere in between. And they actually architecturally reached some sort of compromise between the two rituals going on in the synagogue. It's really interesting to see architecture reflecting, a kind of spiritual dimension as well in the building. They only had about 40 years to enjoy that building before it disappeared in the Great Fire of 1838, which took out the majority of King Street in that area as well. This is the one item that survived from that earlier building. It was made out of marble, and it is now, if you do go to the synagogue, it is now in the entry vestibule over the front doors. But going back to the interior view, what these walls witnessed just about a dozen years before the fire destroyed them, would really impact the new building that's there today. And maybe a slight detour again to explain how belief can have impact on architecture. Jews, as I suggested, did well in Charleston. They became accepted members of society. And in this new world where invention and reinvention was possible, it would really be easy for Jews to assimilate, to walk away from their identity. And this was one of the fears that some of the young men in the congregation, that their children might drift away from Judaism. In your tours, you might see the Huguenot church and past that. And interestingly, the same thing is happening in Charleston with the French Huguenot church in the 1820s as well. French is no longer spoken. Services in that church go defunct, and it's quiet for a generation. And so then there are other churches in town that Protestants can go to, but not so with the synagogue. So now we have enter Isaac Harvey, born in Charleston in 1788. He's married with children. He's a school teacher in town, and he's one of the young men that are afraid of their children drifting away from Judaism. While he grew up in this synagogue, the congregation was still cleaving to the Sephardic ritual. Hour-long services, no sermon, no English, only Hebrew and Spanish, languages most of the congregation did not know, especially those coming from a German background. The old culture was dying out in the 1820s, and as I said, the Huguenots were experiencing the same thing. To prevent this from happening from the young Jewish people in town, 30 young men or so, led by Isaac Harvey, petitioned the Adjunta, which was the board of the synagogue, for reform. They wanted shorter services, they wanted a sermon in English, and they were expelled. They turned around and founded the Reformed Society of Israelites in 1824, almost exactly 200 years ago today, and it's a move that historians now see as the beginning of a New World adaptation of an ancient faith in Charleston, South Carolina. This prayer book is Isaac Harvey's handwritten one. It's sort of the genesis of Reform Judaism, and it's now on display at the College of Charleston. The existence of the Reform Society was short. Isaac Harvey moved to New York. He died in 1828, and the Reform and the co-founders returned to the congregation. But the spirit of reform was still alive when the fire of 1838 took out the early synagogue building. So pretend like you don't see the big Greek revival building that's standing there. I leave it to your imaginations. It's not there yet, but that's the building standing today. But so they did build that very, very small little building, tabernacle, right next door. And so then after the fire, they immediately built back a place where they could worship, but they agonized over how to build the new building. It would only take them a year and a half to build it, but it actually took them 3 years to do it. Interestingly, every church burned in the fire of 1838 was built back in the Greek Revival style. We have St. Mary's, the Catholic Church, right across the street from KKBE. We've got St. Johannes Lutheran Church a block away, and then we have St. Andrew's, now Redeemer Presbyterian Church, just a block away too. And so then everyone, like I said, is built back in the prevailing Greek Revival style. Before the fire, they all looked like St. Michael's. They were rectangular buildings with steep roofs and large steeples. KKBE is the same. It is certainly built back in the Greek Revival, and again showing how Charleston Jews are integrated but not assimilated into Charleston society. And so then, as I said, they agonized over what to do, how to build this building back. But while they were agonizing over that, the reformers were agitating within the congregation. And obviously, if members were going to argue about how to reinterpret a 1,000-year-old religion, they were certainly going to argue about the building that they were going to worship in. So it's my contention, or gentle suggestion at least, that this tug of war over the past and present was played itself not just out in the schism in the congregation, but in also how the building was actually constructed. A series of architects were interviewed by the board of KKBE, including Charles Reichert, who had worked with the great German architect Karl Friedrich Schinkel. Reichert was then right around the corner building the Charleston Hotel, unfortunately a great structure which no longer survives. But it was a firm out of New York City, Tappan and Noble, that got the contract for the congregation. They drew something like an elevation, and the minutes say that the congregation was going to stretch and frame that drawing on a canvas. It does not survive. To get working drawings, they paid more funds out to an architect named Cyrus Warner in New York. After that, we know David Lopez, a member of the congregation, was the contractor chosen to realize the plans, and thus Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim becomes the first synagogue in America actually built by a Jewish man himself. He used slave labor, and in 2020, KKBE became the only second congregation in the city to mark the fact with a memorial acknowledging that slaves went into the building of that structure, and the congregation is determined through social justice to amend that. Looking at this Habs drawing done of the structure that Lopez built, it's obviously that Tappan and Noble took their design from the work of James Stewart and Nicholas Rivette's Antiquities of Athens, those 4 volumes published in the early 19th century. The plate used is obviously the Temple of Hephaestum. They apparently struck close to that drawing of the structure, seen here in the peristyle and porticos surrounding the building. Tappan and Noble's idea was to include at least a southern portico along the side of the street, the side of the building that faced the street, and they were going to include a center door in the southern flank, creating a transept and aisle going north to south, which after some congregational debate was sided against the vote. So obviously you can see that the southern portico was not built, just the portico on the front. So this is what the southern flank looks like today, and that's also where conjecture comes in. The decision could have been made for economic reasons. Leaving the southern portico off would certainly have made it cheaper to build. But consider this. If you were to have a door in the center of the southern side, cross aisles would have to meet in the center of the sanctuary. And that obviously would have to be where the reader's desk would be. And that's what was done in Ashkenazic or German congregations. But KKBE was still ritually and titularly Sephardic. And if you remember that earlier slide showing the compromise of the reader's desk between not necessarily where the Sephardim wanted it and not necessarily where the Ashkenazim wanted it, putting the center aisle and having them meet in the center would have made that building architecturally a German synagogue and not a Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. So by eliminating the southern portico and center door, the compromise between them is sort of kept, and the reader's desk is moved again off-center as it was in the earlier building. So I think we have to consider that that's why the congregation decided against a southern portico and a transept. The contract that they drew up, though, is an incredible document. It specifies Santo Domingo mahogany for the ark, best Connecticut brownstone for the cornice and the molding, blue granite for the foundations, Carolina gray brick for the walls, and the northern brick for the columns, and marble for the Ten Commandments. The interior carvings are really wonderfully, and you can see by the previous work done by Jean Waddell that the latest pattern books were used from Menard Lefebvre's 1833 Modern Building Guide. You can see there in the columns holding up the entablature around the ark, and the design and the plaster dome in the ceiling, a Roman dome in a Greek building taken from Menard Lefebvre's Beauty of Modern Architecture. The saucer dome really is one of the visual triumphs of the interior. It's 50 feet across, but it's only 6 feet deep. So well designed that it actually gives it a much higher and a more elevated feeling and really elevates the whole sanctuary. The irony is that although we have all these documents describing how the building was going to be built, we really do not know what the interior looked like. So this is a poor illustration where we can kind of guess, based on a drawing of a 1834 New York City interior, is probably how the building rebuilt was built, with an ark at the end with a pediment and kind of a top as well too, and then balconies along the sides with balusters, and the reader's desk somewhere in the center. And so then we guess that's probably what the interior of that building looked like. But KKBE had one thing that no other synagogue in America ever did. In 1840, when the walls were going up, a petition was put forward to add an organ. There had never been an organ in an American synagogue up to this. Music had been lost when the Second Temple was destroyed in AD 71 by the Romans, and it was believed that music was not going to be put back into synagogues until the Messiah came and restored the Jews into Jerusalem, and the temple was rebuilt. So this is the third organ, replacing the Henry Urban organ that was taken to Columbia, South Carolina during the Civil War and unfortunately burned there. What the public saw in the dedication in 1841, when Gustavus Poznański called this temple our Jerusalem, it began to change in 1879, when reform was totally in control. Women were allowed to come downstairs from the balconies, and the reader's desk was removed from that same sort of position that it held in the earlier synagogue, and it was actually moved toward the eastern end of the synagogue, in front of the ark, to create something like a Protestant church's pulpit. So with everyone facing front, facing east, the original pews were removed and the current pews installed, 3 aisles, center, left, and right, all facing east. So you know what? Now it's not an old world synagogue anymore. It's no longer a Sephardic synagogue. It's no longer an Ashkenazic synagogue, but it is totally American synagogue. And so God supposedly takes hand in the next renovation of the building in the 1886 earthquake. The building survived, but the interior balconies on the north and south walls tumbled, and so they were removed, and making the balcony, the only balcony left, now the organ loft, and it's kind of got that curvilinear design that you can see there now. So this is what happened in 1879. But the stained glass windows were put in back then too. A small room, a rabbi's study, was added to the back, allowing the ark to be recessed 6 feet into the wall around the columns, and entablature shifted backwards again, and that actually allowed for more seating, since more people, men and women, could now sit downstairs together. And so then again, the impact of religion on architecture. Since then, since 1879, everything's been cosmetic. Gas is given away to electricity. Air conditioning has been added. There's now ADA accommodations for the bema. The pulpit's been enlarged. 2 candelabra, one shown here, somehow survived from the original sanctuary, but they're not pictured in that Carvalho image. They stand on wooden plinths to the base of the reader's desk. They're lit every Sabbath and every holiday. How they survived, we have no idea. And the script on them is elusive and hard to read. And I think this might be an appropriate spot to end my talk on KKBE, leaving it to its mysteries. We know so much about it. Yes, we scholars have researched and written on it, and this has actually been sort of an exegesis on it this morning. But there are things that we will never know, and things, forgive the pun, that we'll have to take on faith. I do hope that y'all get a chance to see the sanctuary sometimes as too. And if you do, I invite you to ponder what the manifestations in brick and stone and plaster meant to the congregants who's made it one way and then changed it to their views as their religious views changed as well. Of course, the past can't come back, but what's left of us is a gift to us to cherish and to maintain. And I'm happy to report that Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, in its 275th anniversary and its 200th anniversary on the birth of Reform, is actually doing just that, taking great care of that building and inviting y'all all in. So thank you all for listening.